Good. Can you hear me if I don't use the thing? So my name is Marcelo Camperi. I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at USF. And I'm keenly aware of how much you enjoy hearing the person who is going to introduce the person who is going to introduce them. So I'm going to keep it very, very, very short. But I just wanted to be here to welcome you to USF, to this special event, and to thank you for being here. This is, for us, what we call a Dean's Lecture, one of our signature events, the first one in the spring semester, but it's also reminiscent of readings and Love Mountain and a number of things that are so intimately related with the person who we welcome here today. And so in addition for us to be a big deal in itself, it's also an even bigger deal because we have a family member who's coming back home and a friend for so many of us here. So that's all I'm going to say. So I'm very happy to have you here. And I'm also very happy to introduce Dean Rader, Professor Dean Rader, who is going to introduce our insurance. So, Dean.
Aaron told me I had to use this clip-on mic. Is this good?
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay? I'm going to keep this for the whole night, Shurin. So when I got the call a few days ago inviting me to do tonight's introduction, I was thrilled to get a chance to talk about my former colleague, my fellow poet, and my friend Aaron Shurin. But just as quickly, I was seized with dread that a lame intro might disappoint my former colleague, fellow poet, and friend Aaron Shurin. But I figure if you are a writer and you're not used to disappointment, you're not a writer. As Aaron knows, this introduction could go in any number of directions. Part of me wants to talk about his role as the first director of what is now the great MFA program here at USF. He and I worked together with and for the program in various capacities for over a decade. So it's great to have him back here. To be sure, the program's existence and reputation is what it is in large part because of Aaron. He set a really high bar for mentorship and interaction with students that I admire. Another part of me is really interested in Aaron's various poetic associations, whether it's the San Francisco Poetry School, his affiliation with the language poets, the good gay poets, the prose poem. I was talking with this guy, Brian Clements, who's the editor of the prose poetry magazine Sentence. He was telling me that in the world of the prose poem, Aaron is legendary, which is true. And he's even become an expert of the lyric essay. I was talking with Micah Ballard earlier about all of the many associations and worlds that one might associate with Aaron, and we were marveling at the fact that even though he might be attached to these schools, he's never been hemmed in by them. He's always migrated through them and moved out of them in his own way. There's also Aaron Shurin, the social critic. His 1977 Unbound, A Story of AIDS, is moving and intimate and wholly engrossing. In language both lyrical and conversational, Aaron explores the effects of AIDS, both on those with and without the disease, and those who suffer in its various forms. 20 years later, Unbound holds up as a story of a man, a city, and an epidemic. There's also Aaron Shurin, the Poetics scholar. For those of you unfamiliar with his recent book from the prestigious Poets on Poetry series from the University of Michigan Press, it's time to get familiar with this wonderful book called The Skin of Meaning. It's a collection of essays, reviews, and lectures that span 30 years of smartness. Most remarkable of all may be how all of these Aaron Shurins merge in his newest book, Flowers and Sky. Is it criticism? Is it essay? Is it poetry? Is it a lecture? Is it memoir? The answer might be found in a reflection of Robert Duncan. If you read or spend time with Aaron, you know he's fond of referencing a comment Duncan makes about the work of the poet H.D. about whom Duncan says, "It was a responsibility to glory that she touched in me." So, what is Erin's new book? It's Glory. Please welcome Erin Shurin.
Oh, thank you, Dean and Dean. You know, I introduced so many people in so many reading series, and my goal was always, one, to excite people about their work, but also to make the writer herself, or himself, feel great about themselves. So I feel pretty good, thank you. Well, first, how does that sound? Is that too much? That's good? Okay. So first, I want to thank Marcello Campari and the Arts and Sciences, the Office of the Dean of the Arts and Sciences, for inviting me here, inviting me home, as you say, and to the MFA Writing Program in the English Department for co-sponsoring it. I see so many friends and colleagues and former students. I'm very happy to be home at USF. I'm very happy to be here on this beautiful Lone Mountain campus where I had my office for many years. And I'm especially happy to be in the enchanted ballroom of Lone Mountain 100. So apt for this talk, which is Sometime of the Night, a poet, his Shakespeare, and the language of flowers. Before I go any further with the talk, I want to tell you at the outset that I am not a botanist, nor am I a Renaissance scholar per se. I am a poet, and this is very much a poet's tale. Its territory is that magical border where sound meets sense. So please lean back and let the wild vowels bloom. I've been invited to participate in a colloquium called The Poet's Shakespeare in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. I thought, well, I am a poet, if not the poet. And Shakespeare is my Shakespeare, so it made sense to talk about my own writing's relation to Shakespeare's work. And that, as you will see, led me inevitably to his great comedy of transformations, A Midsummer Night's Dream. If you don't know or don't remember the play, here are a few pertinent details. Oberon, king of the fairies, is angry with Titania, queen of the fairies, and decides to play a serious trick on her. He asks his young sidekick, the sprite Puck, to go to a certain riverbank full of flowers and bring back one particular bloom. When the juice from this flower is squeezed on Titania's sleeping eyes, she will fall in love with the first thing she sees when she wakes up. And of course, Titania does get properly juiced, as well as a quartet of Athenian lovers, and the comedy ensues. For now, that's all you need to know, because it's not really to the fairies or to the lovers that we're headed, but to that same enchanted riverbank full of flowers. And so, Sometime of the Night. I keep circling back. Oh, I'm going to put on my clever little light here. There. I keep circling back, as if trying to unwind a spell, as if I could unpop the rhymes, unthread the music, and release the measure. But no, not to unmake them, to come again to their making, to feel anew the sway of the spell, and the bell of the rhyme, and the swell of the measure. 400 years strong in themselves, and 50 years alive in my own body. So, I return again and again to my dream, my Midsummer Night's Dream. As what now? Puck with a gray beard? A goat boy with a cane? And to the lines that seem to have been my birthright, Oberon's flower soliloquy, spoken to Puck as a prelude to delivering to or on Titania the magic flower juice that will awaken her to her fate, to the intoxication of love, to falling instantly and transformingly in love, just as the spoken lines awakened me to my own fate of falling in love with language through the transforming power of poetry. I know a bank, Shakespeare's King of Fairies tells Puck, Act 2, Scene 1, in the enchanted woods near Athens. I know a bank where the wild thyme blows, where oxlips and the nodding violet grows, quite over-canopied with luscious woodbine, with sweet musk roses, and with eglantine. There sleeps Titania sometime of the night, lulled in these flowers with dances and delight. And there the snake throws her enameled skin, weed wide enough to wrap a fairy in. Yes, as I have often told the tale, at the age of 17, I thought to play Oberon in our high school production of Dream, and buried my face full force in those flowers, inhaled them, absorbed them, and declaimed the lines in rooms, on city streets, in my bed and in my sleep, I suppose, and still declaim them. Though it was the role of Puck that was given to me, it was Puck who claimed me, and Puck who I became. And yet, myself transformed by what I'd memorized, a Puck who owned the ritual and the right to command himself to service, to spell himself, I'll say, to awaken himself into love, and to figure the love in language in the shape of poems. I know a bank, I say, and around me the flowers bloom, the flower words in their spectral aura and rich sensory evocation, incantatory zeal. And what of this bouquet of text, this enchanted embankment where fairies sleep and wake? What of the sounds that melt the mind, of the scents that flavor the spell, of the petals that form the matrix of meanings that power the poem, of the woozy beauty, the lassitude, the sleeping figure of the dream, the wildness, the lusciousness and sweetness, the musk, the lips, the bed of skin, the night, the night, the night. What of the violet hue, the rosebud and the egg, the light and shine, the mad growth of things, and the knowing, and the knowing. 8 short lines, but pull apart the petals, gently, gently, of this spray of primal energy, a hypnotic syllabary spreading outwards in its hush and woozy beauty. Pull apart the petals to show the links, for the lassitude lulled in these flowers, for the sleeping figure of the dream, there sleeps Titania, the wildness where the wild thyme blows, the lusciousness and sweetness and the musk, with luscious woodbine, with sweet musk roses, the lips where ox lips, the bed of skin, the snake throws her enameled skin, the night. There sleeps Titania sometime of the night. The violet hue and the nodding violet grows. The rosebud and the egg with sweet musk roses and with eglantine. The light and shine, delight, enameled skin. The mad growth of things, the nodding violet grows quite over canopied. And of course, the knowing, the deep knowing. I know a bank. So I fell and fall under Shakespeare's spell. I felt the sonorities. I swooned at what Pound, according to Robert Duncan, called the tone leading of vowels. That unfolding rise and fall and shapeshift of transitions in the vocal pattern. And the circulations of the rhymes, the tickle of alliteration, the arousal of assonance, the full phonemic play in speech, these words are spoken, that seem to register in sounds the total sensory field of flower, person, wind, ground, and sleep, as though the soliloquy itself were a waking dream into which one fell into full seeming. What did oxlips or eglantine look like? What were their attributes of color or scent? For many, many years, I didn't know or care. The flowers were their names, and they bloomed as sonic text, not visual image. They were bursting nodes in a sound pattern, auditory evocations in the service of an elaborate music of transformations, by which the players, the readers, and the spectators might come to participate in the enchantments of love. Now I can see the yellow and pink blossoms and gather the scents from what I know and feel the stems and foliage appropriate to a riparian grove. Of course, Shakespeare knew what flowers would thrive on his bank and might emit the fumes to cloud the senses for his dream. And from that Renaissance model, I quickly came to understand that the language of flowers, the taxonomy and identification, the knowledge of their attributes, the ability to name their names, was part of a poet's duty. As in most things poetic, the goal was to pay attention, to see the world in its constituent parts, and only by raising the parts in their specificity could one begin to engage the living whole. If I wanted to be a real poet, very soon I did, I would have to know my flowers. I did have some inclination and some preparation. As a boy at summer camp, I reveled in the eastern fields of black-eyed Susans, knew them and sought them out and marveled at them with their black berry lumps at the center and long buttery fringes. And in the canoes on those woodland ponds, I slipped through water lilies opening and closing like hands, overjoyed at their pastel hardiness, their drunken starbursts of pink and cream. Later in Texas, with my first ever backyard, I was 9, I planted borders of riotous zinnias, those crenellated macaroons in moony hues, and reached a pure satisfaction in junior stalks of morning glories twining and trumpeting their iridescent blue. Those were gentle forays and not yet connected to a poet's craft. But in the summer of 1969, having formed from the classroom on out a deep apprenticeship and growing friendship with Denise Levertov the great American poet. I found myself walking through the Maine woods and fields with her as she pointed out clusters of forget-me-nots and raspberries ripe for picking. And we stood gaping before a great poplar, thrilled by the wind. That poplar, she writes in writing to Aaron from Life in the Forest, that gave us its open secret, pressed on us all we could grasp and more of vibrating silver green being. Pay attention. A few days earlier, I'd read her poem Annuals, whose flower names, Cosmos and the Marvel of Peru, rivaled those of Shakespeare's in their evocative power. Attending these plantings for her garden from Cotyledon on out, she watches in worried suspense as no flower buds appear. If August passes flowerless and the frosts come, she asks, will I have learned to rejoice enough in the sober wonder of green, healthy leaves? So I learned to watch in wonder and find the names for what I saw and peel back the names to discover the sensory details of color or scent, or meet head on the richness of the no-flower flower. I had begun my first journal in 1968, a thin, tightly lined record with a black pebbled cover. And it bore witness to my awakening interest in poetry as I transcribed Annuals, and soon after Sylvia Plath's Poppies in July, Little Poppies, Little Hell Flames. The summer after my visit with Denise, I traveled to Europe, and the journal finds me walking through the miniature hills and dales of Wales. On July 30th, 1970, I looked across to the horizon where hilltops mounted the far distances, only to discover them at my feet a short while later, fooled by the scale of the terrain. What I presumed to be mountains far away turned out to be little hills a few hundred yards in front of me. A land of fairy tales and little people, I wrote. Towns nestled right into the crook of a hill, invisible from a mile away. And then, this first journal of my writing apprenticeship comes to a close with a single phrase. Along a little riverbank, patches of forget-me-nots. And pressed onto the final page with a fading piece of tape is a small, still unforgettable spray of once blue flowers. If flowers, by their nature, have a look-at-me quality, their goal, after all, is to get noticed and pollinated, I rose to the task with the fervor of a dizzy bee on the make. Toot Sweet of 1978 charges into the fray with a final poem of the rain-drenched sequence rhapsodizing the wet rose up the randy roots, a fibrous pull of ooze blooming, the tumescent reach, ground hiving, heaving, leafing, the flung seed bursting, the rising rose. For sure, I was feeling my way through a host of formal adventures in Toot Sweet. But what's already clear is that flowers and I would meet in a zone of unabashed exuberance. By 1997's prose meditation, July, from Unbound, a Book of AIDS, I'd flung myself shamelessly towards a tabletop bowl of almost mythic roses, summer forever. These swollen roses puffed on the dining room table, creaming pale magenta, lavender, and pink in a moire pattern, fading color into color the way silk does, seizing light and inhabiting the shine from within. If I pushed on the noble powers of description to exercise my flamboyant sympathy, I was still learning boundaries, still testing my gardener's pen. Involuntary Lyrics from 2005 rides its nervy syntax into a more compressed encounter as I walk among moon-pod wild thistles, shaggy, noon seeming midnight in their spooky glare, and wind silvery eucalyptus leaves and their pentagram nuts. Or I sit on a log in a park where heart-shaped clover fluffs up, dewdrops play globe, stinky acacias blooming youth like glandular smell befits a day seems young, with plum blossoms pinking the air. Or I address the sober but lovely blooming bush of leptospermum. Dear leptospermum, tiny magenta flowers on needly branches, please know I meant no offense, mistakenly conflating you with AIDS-related intestinal disorder, cryptosporidium. Or returning to a summer song, airs stilled again as incipient summer does. Suppressed breathing pulls truth out of poppies, blaring just the yellow condensation pure sun lies in. With hawk on cypress branch squawking at me, by best perchable fallen log, Scotch broom yellow too, perfuming the still air as time itself be speaking tongue. Thistles at midnight, pentagram pods, dewdrops that appear to be whole globes, the mysterious leptospermum, hushed breathing as poppies extrude sunlight. You begin to sense the possibility of an enchanted embankment for me. For a poet, the language of flowers engages the world in its radiant particularities, reenacts an active seduction of sight and scent, reveals the primal power of fruition in cyclical time, and carries the charges of symbolic orders from folklore to science. Pay attention, I tell myself. Learn the names, study the attributes, look, inhale, attempt the impossible, represent. In King of Shadows from 2008, the lyric essay gives me full measure to spread my petals. In an essay called Dahlias, about the futility of metaphor and description, I stand before Golden Gate Park's Dahlia Garden in preposterous full bloom, and nevertheless give it a rousing try. About 50 square yards of outsized, over-petaled, shaggy, booming flowers, speckled and striped, ruffled and layered, and speaking colors I've never even known the name of, much less how to evoke. Magenta and mauve, too Victorian and too stable. Bright yellow, too singular and lacking a thrust of energy. Red, but with black bleeding it. Orange? You must be kidding. This livid, churning, moodlet fire. The range of dahlia shapes here taxes taxonomy. Some have fluted petals like rows of curled tongues that amass in starched collars and speak Dutch. Some have the blousy overdetermination of kings and queens, mighty, almost weary figureheads overhanging their propping stalks, those plebeian supporters. They seem to defy the appropriate laws of architecture and physics that gather around plant physiology, physiognomy, too big, too weighty, too fraught with glamour and purposelessness. What is a flower but a momentary eruption of streaming energy, of the power of generation and the condensation of senses into a fleeting burst of creative energy, a poem blasting forth in temporal vibrations by which we might fall in love with the world again, as though awakening from a dream. If Oberon's soliloquy had dazzled me into a kind of mnemonic stupor, though an ecstatic stupor for sure, in the end, the heart of the matter was transactional. The interrelated responses of gardener and garden, of the perfume and the inhaler, the player and the audience, the spellcaster and the spellbound, constitute a mutual magnetic twining like a double helix as an avenue to the pure flowing life force. Shakespeare's flower-strewn bank is, after all, purposefully interactive, a bloom in the service of transformative magic that will be visited upon Titania and the Athenian lovers. If some blossoms lull us into a dream state, defenses down, power off, they merely set the stage for another flower that will juice our juices and turn us on, way on. In 2003, I sublet a house in ultra-verdant Marin County for a small sum and a promise to tend the stunning garden back. What was proposed as a small watering chore turned out to be a Herculean effort of weeding, soaking, and mothering. In reciprocity, I detail the struggle and the reward as the garden responds to my care with an explosion of feeling and an explosion of descriptive language fueled by a 150-word sentence. New perennials constantly sprang up unannounced, filling in small barren spots with their surprise attractions. Tiny yellow-chinned violets, effulgent purple dahlias, a two-headed pink Gerbera daisy, willful strands of magenta sweet peas that would climb your hand if you left it resting too long, one pure but incongruous fumy gardenia. While over the course of the summer, the stalwart artichoke opened its crustacean leaves into a livid, heaving crown of scintillating blue, enrapturing the bees who grazed inside the oversized bloom as if it were a meadow. The strawberries dropped their hot, sweet hearts into my hand by the cupful, and the morning glories, who owned the house, raged over the front wall, withered in a morning minute, and bled their indigo trumpets into translucent pink discs, shedding them finally like wrinkled carapaces onto the porch steps. Then blared moonily again the next day, blue bright as high twilight, and uncountable in their fluorescent profusion. Oregano and marjoram blossomed and began to dry in the air, spiking the night with hot summer undertones. I think I could say I reached saturation. The reciprocity was truly engaged. After sleeping, waking, and falling in love, the marriage of gardener and plant is the garden, and as the marriage of the poet and the language of flowers is the poem, and the union of Renaissance writer and postmodern scribe, an intertextual transepical dance across time in the form of a florid address. Then let me be Oberon, who casts the spell, and Puck, who carries the potion, and Titania, who falls madly in love, all together, all at once. Oberon, she shall pursue it with the soul of love. Puck, I'll put a girdle round about the earth in 40 minutes. Titania, what angel wakes me from my flowery bed? In fact, my compositional dance with Shakespeare and Midsummer has revolved around more than flowers. In the title piece of King of Shadows, I tell the full and surrounding tale of my performance of Puck and splice small phrases from the play into a narrative of diving in and coming out, into the poetic music of the play and out into the arms of men. For the play served me as a dual initiation into the true great body and soul arcs of my life. The memorization and performance of Shakespeare's language set my whole spirit thrumming like a tuning fork. For when one performs in a play, one experiences in the body's echo chamber the language of all the roles. In verse, the brain's muscle memory sets the encased skeleton vibrating, an experience that can only be described as holistic. The excitement and nuanced tension of the high wire act, by which the play's language, exemplified by the flower sequence, enacted poetry's dynamic drama of sound versus sense. It awakened my imagination to the level of art. Poetry is that literary form in which both the depth function and the surface of language are activated, and pleasures abounding. You are constantly threatened with being in one at the expense of the other. There is no rest. To be in a poem is to live in that constant peril by which meaning is transferred in and out of its form. Language performing sensual, decorative, counter-semantic moves just as it absorbs them into structures of content. Luscious woodbine and sweet musk roses would break away from the very bank in which they're planted as the reader, loathed in these flowers, loses his odoriferous way. The vow of poets attends such elegant suspension as sport, where we are spirits of another sort. From the moment I'd announced, I know a bank, I'd taken that lifetime vow. As for the other vibrations, accepting this role, saying yes to donning ballet slippers and tights, and twerking around the stage all a twinkle, while at the same time feeling the satyrish undertow of cloven hooves, ignited the simmering flame in me that burned through my late adolescent nights. The boy there turned in his bed, restless, a king of fairies, but surrounded by the shadows of men, boys, men, their shadowy parts, turning in his bed, whispering, "Hey, boy, it can be done. Pursue it with the soul of love." Shadowy parts rubbing him through the glimmering night. And because of that, a few short weeks after the production, I met a man in a Boston dormitory who twinkled at me ceremoniously and invited me to his room. His hair curled tight like a satyr, and his eyes were nodding violets. Having been awakened and initiated by a Midsummer Night's Dream, I did, in fact, with little hesitation, say yes again. Then, He slid me a long, mischievous smile and stretched out his arm. "Take hands with me," he prompted tenderly, "and rock the ground whereon these sleepers be." And I did. The circle circles, but doesn't close. In 1985, Barron's began a series of study guides, book notes, and I was invited to participate. There on the list up for grabs was A Midsummer Night's Dream. And so, 20 years after my performance, I returned to the play as a scholar. Within the rubric of the series, lent my enthusiasms to high school students everywhere looking for an end run around Shakes. There, in a note on Titania's resting place, I list again the famous flowers and suggest, to help feel the magic of this passage, you might say these words out loud, since they roll across the tongue with what seems to be a magical power. If somewhere along cold institutional corridors, a soccer jock or science nerd or band member is mouthing the words luscious woodbine and sweet musk roses, I will consider my job well done. And still, there are the orange lilies. Let me tell you about the orange lilies. As morning settled, she watched the petal of the overblown lily, orange cream, fall like a fledgling. The poem Uncontainable from 2013's Citizen begins. As this unnamed woman enters a zone of almost psychedelic observation, the overblown, over-canopied flowers become a portal to another dimension, or at least their transformations of color and line so absorb her attention that her own containing lines and colors begin to dissolve and transform through a kind of amoebic assonance. She is rhyming with the lilies. In this interchange of vamping materium, the curled back lilies in morning light, the poem lets loose its own restraints on language and, all caution to the wind, enacts a textual symbiosis of person and plant in a gymnastic transference of form. As though she bridled at tedious common sense and in a spew let fly her own curling jet, her backflip aurora, her upward peeling splash, sprung lunge santee, in a lexical swoon of music daring sense, and with full power of an exclamation point, the transubstantiation reaches climax as apricot, Eucharist, spillover, jeté. Perhaps I'll imagine students somewhere walking faceless hallways will repeat those words in a befuddled thrill and feel their arching bodies blossom and blow. I know I've never written a string of words as extravagant as apricot, Eucharist, spillover, jeté, and I'm not quite sure anyone else would let themselves. But behind them lie decades of practice and rehearsal, of tree and leaf and bud and vine and bloom. They are my sweet musk roses, and in their swoon, my spell found its making. So let me be Oberon, who casts the spell, and Puck, who carries the potion, and Titania, who falls madly in love. But let me be, too, the magic flower itself, swollen by Cupid's arrow and pulsing with the juice of pure passion, a wildflower in excessus, held aloft in moonlight and squeezed upon, well, your eyes. Certainly we can take a deep breath. I know it says Q&A if you want, Q's and A's. You have the Q's, I have the A's. Any other comments? We don't have to, we can just party on. Does that sound good? Okay.
Do you experience the work differently reading it than you do writing?
You know, in a way I don't, because I read it. When I the soundscape is so important to me as I write. So I think it's actually very similar to me, and what you hear is really how I feel it when I write it. It's live when I read it, and it's supposed to be live when I read it. But I write it with that in my ear very much. Any other questions, observations? Or flowers? Yes.
I'm wondering. It seems like you're not afraid of your process, really, and you talk about that in your poetry.
Yes.
What did it take to get there?
Well, you know, it's just a matter of believing that that's of interest. I trained in poetics, which is really not the writing, but the study of how the poem is made. And to me, it's really important that you have to understand traditions, methods, opportunities. You have to understand all those things to have the facility to employ them. So what's the word? The translucence of the process to me is really essential. There's not a mystery about it. It's learning and experimenting. So I'm very interested in those two things, and I urge younger students to read poetics as much as poetry. In the great program that we were in with Robert Duncan, who you've heard me mention, he actually forbade, and Duncan is here too, he forbade writing workshops. There weren't any writing workshops, it was the study of poetry. Other questions? Yes?
Is there an example that you know of a great poet who did not study poetics?
Who did not what?
Study poetics, and who perhaps wrote in their quiet attic without knowing what rest?
Yes, of course, I'm sure. I don't say that that's necessary. I'm not interested in prescriptive or proscriptive processes in writing. I think for most of us it's interesting to engage those varieties of information in the process. But some genius, some little Mozart somewhere who can write great poems, I'm in awe of. So I don't say go to the library, sir.
When Dean introduced your work, described your work as like, is it memoir, is it a poem, is it academia,
Yeah.
What was did you have an intent for it to be sort of that kind of mixed genre?
I think it's grown up into that. The more I've written, the more, once I got hold of the lyric essay, and I started writing prose poems, there became less and less of a difference in what my operations, though there is a difference in the critical essay. I love prose and I love poetry, and the opportunity to unite them just seemed to me a glory, that glory. So, that I'm a maximalist, and whatever offers me the fullest possibility, that's what I'm drawn towards. And as you heard in my 150-word sentence, I'm very charmed by sentences. I like the opportunities they have, and they also, you can just kick the hell out of them, Yes?
Do you have an inspiration for your botanical references?
There are a number of writers who I adore that I would say at the beginning, Virginia Woolf really was the person who kind of ignited my interest in flowers and writing about flowers, and also Colette. And they're two amazing writers who understand flowers extremely. So I recommend both of their work, and Proust also. So it's funny that they're prose writers, but those are the people who really fired my imagination in terms of, and Emily Dickinson and Denise Levertov also kind of catalyzed my imagination around what flower nature could offer. There's a beautiful a piece of writing by Colette. I think it's called My Mother's House, where it starts with a letter from her mother to her then husband. And the mother explains that she loves her daughter dearly, but she's not going to be able to come visit this year because her cactus, which blooms once every 10 or 20 years, is about to bloom. And she has to attend that blossom, so she gives her condolences that she can't visit Colette. And Colette understands it completely.
Aaron, you were saying that you came to flowers through Woolf and Colette and Proust. Did you find at some point, even with Shakespeare, that you're dealing with a European botany as an American? Was there some sort of translation process that you had to go through?
There really wasn't for me, except in Proust. It seemed to me like these great passages around Hawthorne, and I just didn't know what Hawthorne was, really, and I had to scrape around about that. With the Shakespeare, it didn't matter to me, obviously. It was many years later till I looked them up and see what they were. And with Virginia Woolf, that was not a problem. I remember crocuses and tulips, and color kind of grows up the top. Color, something like grows up the stalk and blows out the tulips. That's from Virginia Woolf. So tulips, I knew.
No, I had to look up oxlips because
Yeah. No, I didn't
we
know
don't
any
have
of
them
them.
around here.
No, I didn't know oxlips or woodbine or any of those. In that sequence, it didn't matter to me. It was the sound that mattered. But later, it was interesting. But it still mattered very little, interestingly enough, in that sequence.
What I've been noticing this year is that, of course, the flowers are coming out early, daffs are way too early, so are the magnolias, and of course we know how that's happening. How's that affecting the way you write about flowers?
Yeah, I don't, my duty is to pay attention, really, and I think the necessary duty is to get people to pay attention to the world so that they don't trample it. So for me, that's just a matter of registering as I see it, what I can. So I'm not sure about how those things have changed, or at least have they changed yet, but they certainly might. There's wine, there's water, there's coffee, there are cookie menus, and lots of talk. So Thank you for coming.